We hear it constantly, don't we? People dismissing tragic events with a simple phrase. Something like that would never happen in my town. It's almost as if we believe that our communities are immune to the sorrows that befall others, but time and time again we are proven wrong. It's the towns that often utter those words with the most conviction that find themselves grappling with unimaginable tragedy. It's natural human instinct to believe that our hometowns are safe havens, shielded from the horrors that plague the rest of the world. We grow up in these tight-knit communities, knowing our neighbors by name and trusting in familiar faces we see every day. We take comfort in the thought that our streets are immune to crime and our schools are as safe as they could possibly be. Our homes are protected from disaster, yet the harsh reality is that tragedy knows no boundaries, and it can strike anywhere, anytime, at any place, even the places we least expect. Hey, hi, hello friends, happy Thursday. I am back yet again for another episode of True Crime with Kenz. I am your host, Kenzie. Today we will be delving into an extremely frustrating and confusing case that takes place in Germany, so I'm going to say that now because I am going to butcher everything that is German in this case, and I am saying that right now, so please do not hate me. But this case covers the Hinterkaifeck murders. As always, full show notes are available at truecrimewithkenz.com. And before we get started, I want to acknowledge that these are real people and real tragedies that we will be discussing today. Please be kind when leaving a comment or discussing this case on social media out of respect for the victim's family. This podcast is for educational purposes, and this is all information that I have found on the internet and I compiled into a single recording. All opinions in this podcast are mine and mine alone, and nothing should be done in compliance with the information provided in this episode. All of that being said, let's get into today's case. Hinterkaifeck was a small farmstead located between the Bavarian towns of Ingolstadt and Schroeschenhagen, about an hour's drive from München and a half a mile or a hinter from the town Kaifeck. The farmstead consisted of a few buildings, including a farmhouse, a barn, and a tool shed. The nearest neighbor was a considerable distance away, contributing to the farm's isolated and peaceful setting. The Hinterkaifeck was situated in a rural and secluded area, contributing to the difficulty of immediately discovering and investigating this crime. The farmstead was home to the Grubner family: Andreas, his wife Katja, their widowed daughter Victoria, and her two children Katja and Josef. Also living with them was their maid Maria. I want to talk about each of these victims in detail so we can really get to know them as people. However, this case did take place in 1922, so there wasn't a lot of information for me to actually find about them. So the information that I did find, take it with a grain of salt because I am unsure of how true this is. I did my best in trying to fact check all of this, but there were a lot of conflicting sources because this case is over 100 years old. A lot of the reporting on it was either lost or something of that nature. Andreas was born March 29, 1859, in Kaifeck, Bavaria. Limited information is available about his early life, but it's likely that he grew up in a rural farming community. Andreas is married to Katja Grubner. The couple had one child together, Victoria. Andreas was known as the patriarch of the Hubner family and the owner of the Hinterkaifeck. Andreas was described as a stern and temperamental individual, which led to speculation with potential conflicts within the family. Katja was born May 17, 1850. I couldn't find much information about her either, so we're just going to go with that. Victoria Hubner was born on February 28, 1887, and was the only biological child of Andreas and Katja Grubner. Victoria married Karl Gabriel, and it's stated that they had two children together, but the timeline of that does not add up, so we're going to say the following. She was married to Karl Gabriel, and he actually died in World War I in 1914, and she had two children. One was born in 1915, and one was born in 1920, so it is likely that the one born in 1915 was the child that she conceived with Karl. However, the one born in 1920 obviously was not his child. Following the death of her husband, Victoria returned to Hinterkaifeck with her two young children. There were reported conflicts and disputes between Victoria and her father Andreas, particularly regarding the inheritance and upbringing of her children. Katja was born in 1915, which was Victoria's first child that she likely had with Karl, and Josef was born in 1920, which, like I said, there was no possible way for him to be Carl's child. Both children were very young at the time of the Hinterkaifeck murders, and I couldn't find any information on Maria, but I do know that she was 44 at the time of the murder. So just for clarification purposes, at the time that this case took place, Andreas was 63, his wife was 72, their daughter Victoria was 35, and her two children, Katja was 7 and Josef was 2. There were some strange occurrences in and around the Hinterkaifeck sometime shortly before the attack. 6 months prior to the attack, the family maid had quit and had been widely claimed that the reason for her leaving was because she had heard strange noises in the attic and believed the house to be haunted. They did end up hiring a new maid, which, like I mentioned, was Maria. In the days leading up to the murder, more strange things began to happen. Grubner told neighbors that he had discovered tracks in the fresh snow that led from the forest to the broken door lock in the family's machine room, but nothing leading back. Andreas had reportedly found a strange newspaper from München on the property March 1922. He could not remember buying it and initially believed that the postman had lost the paper. However, this was not the case, as no one in the vicinity subscribed to the paper. Later that night, they heard footsteps in the attic, but Grubner found no one when he searched the building. Although he told several people about these alleged observations, he refused others' offer of help, and the details went unreported to the police. To make matters even stranger, one of the family's 2 sets of keys disappeared shortly before the murder. But despite these ominous signs, no one in the family reported anything to police. This was important to note because it was in a few of the sources that I read. Katja, Victoria's daughter, reported to her teacher on March 31st that her mother Victoria had fled from the farm the night before the act after a violent quarrel with her father Andreas, and only to be found a couple hours later in the forest. On the afternoon of Friday, March 31st, 1922, the new maid Maria had arrived at the farm. Maria's sister had escorted her there and left the family farm after a short stay. She was likely the last person to see the inhabitants alive. On the night of March 31st, an unknown person, or potentially multiple people, killed each of the 6 family members of the Grubner household. Andreas, his wife Katja, their adult daughter Victoria, and their granddaughter Katja were all lured to the barn through the stable and slaughtered one by one with a matlock. That's a tool similar to a pickaxe. It has a long handle and a short, stout head that combines both an axe blade and a cutter, or a pick and a cutter. After killing the 4 in the barn, the perpetrators moved into the home with the same murder weapon. They attacked Josef and Maria. Josef was asleep in a bassinet in his mother's room, and Maria in her maid quarters. We will get into the details of the crime scene a little bit later in the timeline, but for the sake of the dates making sense, I wanted to mention this on this date at this time now. The unsettling events began to unfold in early April 1922. The family was known for keeping to themselves. Still, neighbors grew concerned because on April 1st, coffee seller Hans Skorodsky and Edward Skorodsky arrived at the Hinterkaifeck to take an order. When no one responded to the door and window knocks, they walked around the yard but found no one. They noticed that the machine house door gate had been open and decided to leave. On April 2nd, the Sunday following the murder, the family missed church service, which was increasingly alarming as Victoria was a part of her church's choir. The following day, Monday, April 3rd, Katja failed to show up for school with no excuse from her parents. By this point, mail for the family had begun to pile up at the local post office. On April 4th, local mechanic Albert Hoffner went to the Hinterkaifeck to repair an engine. He stated that he had not seen anyone of the family, nor had he heard anything, except for the sound of the farm animals and the dog inside the barn. After waiting a couple hours, he decided to go ahead and start his repair, which he completed in roughly 4.5 hours. Around 3:30 p.m., Lorenz Schallenbecker sent his son Johann, who was 16, and his stepson Josef, 9, to the Hinterkaifeck to see if they could make contact with the family. When they reported that they had not seen anyone, Lorenz headed to the farm the same day with Michael and Jacob. Like the previous visitors, they found the farm to be eerily quiet and seemingly devoid of life. This latter suspicion would ultimately be confirmed when the men came down the stable to discover 4 bodies dead in the hay. They quickly realized that the bodies belonged to Andreas, his wife Katya, their daughter Victoria, and 7-year-old Katya Gabriel. Shortly afterward, the maid Maria and the youngest family member Josef were murdered in the homestead. After discovering the crime scene, the party contacted authorities. A day after the discovery of the bodies, court physician Johann Baptist Amur performed autopsies in the barn. It was established that a matlock was most likely the murder weapon, although the weapon itself had not been found at the scene. I want to pause right here. We'll finish the investigation in a moment, but for the sake of painting you a picture of this crime scene, this is where it'll get gruesome, so this is your not safe for work content warning. I'm going to start with the 4 members found in the barn. So Andreas, the right half of his face was smashed, his cheekbones were protruding, and flesh seemed to be shredded, and his face was caked with blood. Katya, his wife, had bruising on her right eye, 7 blows to her head, and 1 in a triangular shape, signs of strangulation, and her skull was cracked. Victoria had 9 star-shaped wounds to the head, strangulation marks on the neck, right side of her face was smashed with a blunt object, and a small round injury of a pointed tool on the upper skull, and her skull was smashed. Katya Gabriel, the daughter, had a lower jaw shattered, a cervical injury due to shock, severe head injuries, her skull was smashed with several blows, and her neck was revealed in a gaping transversal wound. On the right of her face was a circular wound, her face was smeared with blood, and crammed in her hands were hair pieces. Though we lack the estimated times of death, we do know that the granddaughter Katya died last from the horrifying detail that she had her own hair in her hands and she had been ripping it out. She was alive long enough to either witness the butchering or to just see the dead bodies before she was struck, and the girl expressed the horror in the only way she had left. Moving on to the pair found in the home, Maria, the maid, was killed by crosswire blows to the face and the head, crusted with blood. 1 head wound was 4 centimeters deep, and blood was encrusted, probably resulting from a sharp hoe. Josef was killed by a heavy blow to the face, and the top of the bassinet stroller was destroyed. The skulls of the victims were removed and sent to a lab in München for further investigation, but are now considered lost. All victims were placed without their heads in their coffin. I know we're kind of skipping a little bit there, but I think it's so strange, so I wanted to add that in here now. I know that was hard to hear because it was hard for me to talk about, but let's get back into the investigation. Inspector George Regenberg and his department investigated the killings. Investigators initially believed that the motive for the murder may have been a robbery gone awry, but initial investigations were hampered by the number of people interacting with the crime scene, moving bodies and items around, and even cooking and eating meals in the kitchen. The crime scene itself didn't offer any clues to a true motive. The robbery theory was thrown out when police discovered a decent amount of money in the home still. It was clear, however, that the murder they had stayed at the farm for several days. The animals were still being fed, and the family's food had been eaten. The murder weapon was found a year after the slaughter when the farm was torn down. The farm had been searched extensively, and canine units were used as well. Despite all of that, they did not find the murder weapon in 1922. The weapon was identified by George Siegel, a farmhand. Siegel had helped during the harvest and told police that he knew firsthand Grubner had made the matlock himself. Siegel also explained that this matlock was kept in a tool shed with all the other farm equipment. According to a German site, police at the time also failed to secure any fingerprints from the crime scene. The farmstead itself was also razed shortly after the murders, making it nearly impossible to find any usable DNA from the crime. Unfortunately, like I said, the farm was demolished in 1923, and the only thing left is a shrine. With no clear motive to glean from the crime scene, the police began to formulate a list of suspects. There were several prominent suspects at the time, including Victoria's own late husband, who some have claimed to not have actually died in the First World War. So let's look at the list of suspects. Carl Gabriel was the husband of the widowed Victoria Gabriel. He had reportedly been killed in December of 1914 during the First World War by a shell attack in Ariège, France. His body had never been recovered, and after the end of the Second World War, war captives from Skronenberg region who were released prematurely from Soviet capture claimed that they had been sent home by a German-speaking Soviet soldier who claimed to be the Hinterkaifeck murderer. However, some of the men later revised their statement, which diminished their credibility. Many theorize that the Soviet officer in question may have been Karl Gabriel, because those who have claimed to have seen Gabriel after his reported death testified that he had wanted to go to Russia. Lorenz, the gentleman that we discussed earlier who had led the search party to actually identify the bodies at the Hinterkaifeck, he was actually a suspect, so he had believed to have had a relationship with Victoria Gabriel after his first wife died in 1918. And it was believed that he was the father of Josef. Lorenz came under suspicion by locals in the early investigation because of his several suspicious actions immediately after the discovery of the body. When Lorenz and his friends arrived to investigate, they had to break the gate to enter the barn because all of the doors were locked. However, immediately after finding the 4 bodies in the barn, Lorenz apparently unlocked the front door with a key and suspiciously entered the home alone. A key to the house had gone missing several days earlier, like I had mentioned, so it was possible that Lorenz, as a neighbor or as Victoria's potential lover, may have been given a key. When asked by his companions why he had gone into the home alone, it was unclear if the murderer might still be there. Lorenz allegedly stated that he went to look for his son, Josef, and it is known that Lorenz had disturbed the bodies at the crime scene, thus potentially compromising the investigation. For many years after, local suspicion remained on Lorenz because of his strange comments, which were seen as indicative knowledge of details that only the killer would recall. According to the information in the files for the case, local teacher Hans Jagenberg discovered Lorenz visiting the remains of the demolished Hinterkaifeck in 1925. Upon being asked why he was there, Lorenz stated that the perpetrator's attempt to bury the family's remains in the barn had been hindered by the frozen ground. This was seen as evidence that Lorenz had intimate knowledge of the conditions of the ground at the time of the murders. Although being a neighbor and familiar with local land, he may have just been making an educated guess. Another speculation was that Lorenz murdered the family after Victoria demanded financial support for young Josef before his death in 1941. Lorenz conducted and won several civil claims for slander against persons who described him as the murderer of Horningkeff. Adolf Gump was listed as a suspect as early as April 9th due to his connection to the Vorgruppen Oberlin. In 1951, prosecutor Andreas Popp investigated brothers Adolf and Anton Gump in relation to the murders of Hinterkaifeck. Their sister, Karin Sinstead, claimed that on her deathbed that Adolf and Anton had committed the murders. As a result, Anton Gump was remanded to police custody, but Adolf had already died in 1944. A short time after, however, Anton was dismissed again in 1954. The case against him was finally discontinued because he had not been proven to be participated in the crime. In 1971, a woman named Teresa T. wrote a letter citing an event in her youth. At the age of 12, she witnessed her mother receiving a visit from the mother of the brothers Carl and Andreas S. The woman claimed that her sons from Stadtberg were the 2 murderers of Hinterkaifeck. The mother said Andreas regretted that he lost his penknife in the course of the conversation. In fact, when the farm was demolished in 1923, a pocket knife was found that could not be clearly assigned to anyone. However, the knife could have easily belonged to one of the murder victims. This track was followed without result. Kenz Red, the former maid of Hinterkaifeck, was certain that she had already seen the penknife in the yard during her service. Peter Weber was named a suspect by Josef Betz. The 2 worked together as laborers in the winter of 1919 to 1920. The pair shared a room together. According to Betz, Weber spoke of a remote farm. Weber knew that only one old couple lived there and their daughter and her 2 children. It is likely he knew about the incest between Grubner and his daughter. Betz testified in a hearing that Weber had suggested killing the old man to get his family's money. When Betz did not respond to the offer, Weber stopped talking about it. The former maid, Miss Ringer, worked from November 1920 to about September 1921. She suspected Anton and Karl Bickler to have committed the murders. Anton Bickler had helped with the potato harvest at Hinterkaifeck and therefore knew the premises. Rieger said that Blicher would often talk to her about Rubner and the Gabriel family. Anton reportedly suggested that the family ought to be dead. The maid also emphasized in her interrogation that the farm dog, who barked at everyone, never barked at Anton. In addition, she reported speaking with a stranger through her window at night. The maid believed it was Carl, Anton's brother. She thought that Anton and Carl would have committed the murders together with George Siegel, who worked in Hinterkaifeck and knew the family fortune. Supposedly, Siegel had broken into the home in November of 1920 and stole a number of items, though he denied it. He did state that he carved a handle of the murder weapon when he was working at Hinterkaifeck and knew the tool would have been kept in the barn passage. The Thaler brothers were also suspected. According to a statement by the former maid, the brothers were already committed several minor burglaries in the area before the crime. Rieger said that Josef Thaler stood at her window at night and asked her questions about the family, but she gave no answer. In conversation, Josef Thaler claimed to know which family member was sleeping in which room and stated that they had a lot of money. During their conversation, Rieger noted that there was another person nearby. According to her statement, Josef and the stranger looked at the machine house and turned their eyes upward. Author Bill James, in his book The Man from the Train, alleges that a man known as Paul Mueller, a German migrant, may have been responsible for the murders. Mueller was the only suspect in 1898 murder of a Massachusetts family, and James believed that Mueller killed dozens of victims based on the research in an American newspaper archives. The Hinterkaifeck murders bear some similarities to Mueller's suspected crimes in the United States, including the slaughter of an entire family in their isolated home, the use of a blunt-edged farm tool as a weapon, a pickaxe, moving and stacking bodies of the victims, and the apparent absence of a robbery as motive. James suspects that Mueller, described as a German immigrant in contemporary media, may have departed from the U.S. for his homeland in 1912. After private investigators and journalists began to notice and publicize patterns in family murders across state lines. Despite repeated arrests, no murderer has ever been found, and the files were closed in 1955. The last interrogation took place in 1986 before Detective Superintendent Karl Mueller retired. In the inspection record for the court commission, it was noted that the victims were probably drawn to the restlessness of the stable, which is why they were in their barn, resulting in noises from the animals. A later attempt, however, revealed that at least human screams from the barn could not be heard from the living area. On the night of the crime, so 3 days before the bodies were discovered, artisan Michael Pollock happened to pass by the Hinterkaifeck, and he observed that the oven had been heated by someone. That person approached him with a lantern and blinded him, whereupon he hastily continued on his way. Pollock was noticed that the smoke from the fireplace had a revolting smell. This incident was not followed up, and no investigation was conducted to determine what had been burning that night in the oven. On April 1st at 3 a.m., the farmer and butcher Simon Ringenblatter, on his way home near Bruin, saw two mysterious figures on the edge of the forest. When the strangers saw him, they turned around so their faces would not be seen. Later, he heard of the murders in Hinterkaifeck and thought that it was possible that the strangers might have been involved. Disturbing details about the Grubner family have also come into light in the centuries since their murder. For example, in 1914, Andreas Grubner was sentenced to 1 year in prison for incest, and Victoria was sentenced for 1 month in prison. This was the same year that Victoria's husband Karl supposedly died in France. Yet Katja Gabriel was born in 1915 and Josef was born in 1920. It is possible that Josef's father could have been Victoria's temporary lover. Most people believe this to be Lorenzen, as I mentioned, but some have suggested that he may in fact be the result of an incestuous relationship between Victoria and Andreas. There are many theories about who committed the Hinterkaifeck murder, and this case has inspired numerous books, films, and even a musical. But despite all the attention, the truth about what happened at Hinterkaifeck remains a mystery. And with that is all I have for you today covering the Hinterkaifeck murders. This case raises a lot of eyebrows and is frustrating all around. But what are your thoughts on this case? Who do you think did it? Why do you think the killer or killers stayed in the house after committing the murders? I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on this one for sure. Thank you so much for joining me today on True Crime with Kenz this week. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. And if you feel the need to support the show, on True Crime with Kenz, there is a tab called Support the Show, and it links to the Patreon. Do not feel obligated in any way, shape, or form, but if you feel like you want to, that is one way to do it. Follow me on social media for more updates on upcoming episodes. I've been trying to post more on TikTok, so definitely check out my TikTok. With that, I will see you next Thursday. Stay vigilant, and until next time, this is Kenzie, signing off.